Section 2, Chapter 3. The Professor Discusses Nazi Philosophy and Students. I was staying in Berlin in the autumn of 1937 and had dined out one night, and as I came into the hotel about 10 p.m., the head porter told me that a small boy of about 15 years old had come in with a letter for me, but he would not leave it. He said he lived nearby, and that he would come back at 11 p.m. as he wanted an answer. An hour later, the messenger came back with a penciled note with no signature, and addressing me by a nickname I recognized as the password, let me know that the writer was Professor Braun. The passage read, "Railway stations are very good places to meet. Everyone moves and changes around at the tables, and one attracts very little notice, even if one stays a long time. Will you meet me at Friedrichstrasse at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and we can talk all the morning? I have a luncheon engagement at 12:30 till about 2 p.m. That is why I am in Berlin, also to see the friend with whom I am staying and whose son brings this letter. If you would like a second talk and will meet me at, say, 2:15 p.m. at the Anhalter Bahnhof, we could spend several more hours together before I go south again. Please send a reply by the boy with this letter." The next morning, just before 10 o'clock, I got to the Friedrichstrasse Bahnhof. It was a hot day late in August, and only a few days before the annual Nuremberg Congress of the Nazi Party, so that already all the stations and trains were packed with troops, SA and SS men on the move. We glanced into the restaurant, which was crowded out, and at first it seemed hopeless, but men began moving off, and we soon discovered to our delight a table for two in a remote corner. "These troops are a good screen," said Professor Braun. "In fact, we are protected by the German army." After inquiring about a number of English and American friends, the professor said, "I am glad you want more than a superficial explanation of this revolution. It is most important it should be thoroughly understood because its greatest danger lies deeply hidden. But if you really want to understand and to explain to some of my English friends in your universities what is happening today in Germany, you must have much patience, because I want to take you right back to the period after the last war and tell you of the kind of intellectual, moral, and spiritual milestones on the way. In fact," he said, laughing, "I have prepared 2 whole lectures for you, one for Friedrichstrasse this morning, and one for the Anhalter Bahnhof when we meet this afternoon." "How marvelous," I said. "But wait a minute, let me get out paper and pencil and make some notes." "Those also I have made for you, because we only have this one day together, and I want you to understand as much as I can tell you. So I have written down some notes, and we can discuss them, and you can make your own notes at the side. But let us order some coffee first." As we waited for this, he continued, "Of course you realize I shall only deal with one aspect of the problem. I do not deny the economic chaos which made revolution and dictatorship easy. I do not deny the political blunders our leaders have made, and forgive me, I do not deny that England and France and America by their foreign policy must accept some blame that such a revolution came in this country. But even if all these things are true, I am convinced there are some reasons even deeper why Hitlerism succeeded. This country had had many parties and programs before. Why has this one set everything alight? I will try to tell you what I believe to be the reasons. I think some of the things that I am going to indicate, besides being true of our own younger generation in Germany, may in other forms and in varying degrees become true of younger people in many parts of the world. Thousands of troops and SA men must have come in and out of that restaurant as we stayed on and talked for nearly 3 hours. I think the best thing I can do is to recall the notes of these 2 talks. I cannot attempt to report the full discussion, but the notes in the professor's own words may be more interesting. I agree with him that they raise many a question in one's mind about the general tendency to spiritual bankruptcy, and I sometimes think we in our country are living on past capital, and that there are many disquieting signs both in England and America, and I suspect even more in France." Section 1. In order to understand the historical and philosophical background which explains the attitude of the young generation in Germany, it is necessary to consider its attitude at the time of the advent to power of National Socialism. First, then, let me give you a brief review of the past. The development of German youth after the last war and before the National Socialist regime can be described roughly in 3 stages. The first stage was that immediately following the war. The expressionistic youth movement was at its height and was shaping the life of the young people. We can still remember the outward and inward characteristics of that time, the elaborate romanticism, the overflowing vitality, and the quest for novelty. The old order of life had been destroyed in the war, and a new order had to be found. Many thought that the new era had arrived. Today we know that Expressionism was not even a bridge to it, but simply a vanguard which exploded some of the tottering strongholds of a passing age. Small wonder then that this young generation of Expressionists disappeared quickly and completely. The second stage was the turning away from Expressionism, from the intoxication of feeling and the mystical worship of things new, to realism and the present, or as was termed at the time, to the new matter-of-factness. This movement ran parallel with the stabilization of finance, and was in fact a sort of spiritual stabilization. The flight from subjectivism and individualism was now complete. Instead of the ideal of the creative individual, we find the ideal of the community. The ideals and ideologies of the past were really dead now. They had lost all power of persuasion. Interest in sport and technical achievements were the means by which life and the world were to be mastered. A new kind of realism had at last arrived and was coupled with a new respect for reality. Yet even this stage was not the final development. The stabilization in finance as well as in philosophy turned out to be a deception, and therefore there followed one of the most difficult and painful chapters in the development and fate of the young generation in my country. It might be called the process of complete disillusionment. This is the third stage. Looking first at outward conditions, one realizes that the position of youth was becoming increasingly insecure and hazardous. Financial insecurity was a cruel reality. Unemployment, especially depressing among youth, was made even more so by the almost complete lack of hope for the future. This was particularly the case among university students, a section of youth whose carefreeness had once been proverbial. In 1931, 7,000 left the universities and 30,000 entered. In the same year, there were about 40,000 unemployed university people, and it was estimated that in 10 years' time, only about 50% of all university people would find employment. A terrible outlook for a university-trained proletariat. The result of this was that the young generation could no longer look into the future with anything like happiness or confidence. They knew well what it was to fear for their very means of existence. This was a threat to the bourgeois desire for security. Section 2. The spiritual condition. Against this constant fear often existing in the subconscious mind, the will to live of the young generation revolted. It was almost like a hidden testimony to the existence of the Creator, that this desire to live of the younger generation could not be strangled in spite of the hopelessness of their position. The instinctive, one might almost call it the animal will to live, would not die. In this connection a fact arose which was often not understood by the older people. The young generation broke away from the old standards and values, at first slowly and carefully, and then completely. The term new primitivity was coined. The sociologist Rosenstock used it in order to prove that the young generation had voluntarily severed itself from the spiritual world and the older generation. Compared with the many-sided and versatile world of pre-war generations, this new primitivity seemed an impoverishment, which in fact it was in a certain sense. The reason for this was that these young people had absolutely no ties with the pre-war generation. This was equally true of the nationally minded youth. This then was the very condition that made possible the creation of something new in the political sphere, And so it happened that this primitivity and spiritual impoverishment was born of a profoundly distressing fact. The distressing fact was that the older generation, too, had lost so much of the old values that they could hardly be counselors to the younger generation. The great promise for the future was the realization that now that old values had been thrown overboard, the way was clear for a new discovery. In fact, for a spiritual revival, at least among the younger generation. The will to live had not been strangled, but that it was capable of shaping new systems from the broken old ones. Without a clear grasp of this point, it is impossible to understand the rise of the new political movement in Germany and its tremendous influence on the youth at that time. Also, that such fundamental things as discipline, order, and community life once again came to play so important a part. Another characteristic is important. The new primitivity was nothing formal and empty, and was totally different from the general mystical longing for something new. In these years, Hans Grimm, the great novelist and poet, formulated the new spirit in this way. He called the younger generation the youth with the great desire for service, and with this he characterized one of the finest qualities of these young people. In place of the old intellectual reasoning which ruled the idea of post-war youth, we now find a will to sacrifice, if necessary to sacrifice life itself. It may be counted among the great surprises which only real history can have in store, that out of the muddled and often emotional intellectual conditions of the period immediately after the war such an attitude could arise. It was doubtless one of the most important and most sincere preparatory movements for some political change in Germany. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of our time is the wicked exploitation of a mood and attitude that might have been used for the highest ends. Section 3. The political change. This desire for sacrifice and service was very soon to find a focus and a convulsion leading to a political rebirth of the nation. It must be remembered that for many the question of the simple naked existence of the nation as well as their own survival stood out more clearly than at any other time. That new ways had to be found, if the nation was to be preserved from chaos, was perfectly clear even to the older generation. The difference between the older and younger generations lay in the fact that the young had so little faith in the old political recipes that they refused to consider them at all. In the place of these old political ideas came an experience quite new in our history, namely the experience of the people as a community. Thus, an object for service and for the general desire to sacrifice was found and called forth a tremendous response for the youth of the whole country. This train of thought shows clearly how very different the political experiences of the younger generation were from anything that had called itself political thinking. Very few political changes can boast so logical a development as that of 1933. There is another factor of decisive importance, the conception of a political and racial leader and his followers. This characteristic is by no means as alien as it seems to many critics from outside, for it grew directly out of the spiritual change preceding 1933. It shows again that the younger generation did not consider this political change in the light of an intellectual change of program, but rather as a change in their attitude as human beings. Much was written and said in those days in an attempt to explain this change. It was said that man, no longer capable of coping with historical problems, was projecting all his expectations of new and better times into the figure of a Führer. The conception of the Führer quite naturally took the place of the humanistic pictures of man and history, and it is most significant that in place of the old abstract conceptions, there appeared the living, heart and soul embracing, concrete idea of following the Führer. In this we see the greatest historical change of our time, and no one was more thoroughly ready to accept it than the young generation in Germany.